He laughed at the female soldier and challenged her to a fight, unaware of who was standing in front of him. What happened on the parade ground silenced the entire platoon. Subscribe, like, and write in the comments where you are watching from. The bus groaned as it came to a stop, brakes hissing into the thin morning air. The recruits inside shifted uneasily, boots scuffing against the metal floor, the scent of sweat and nervous anticipation already thick despite the hour. Outside, beyond the grimy windows, the world was cloaked in gray. Razor wire stretched along the fences, guard towers rose from the fog like watchful sentinels, and the parade ground lay wet with dew that glittered faintly in the first trace of sunlight. The sound of cadenced chants echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the barracks, steady and sharp, the rhythm of an institution that had been breaking people down and building them back up for generations. Among the line of men filing out of the bus, there was one figure who stood apart without even trying to. Ronda Rousey stepped down onto the gravel with the same steady balance she had used countless times walking into an arena, though this time there were no cameras, no flashing lights, no cheering crowds. Just silence, broken only by the crunch of boots and the sharp bark of an instructor calling the recruits into formation. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag across her shoulder, her gaze calm but alert, scanning the camp that was to be her new world. The stares began immediately. Some recruits let their eyes slide past her quickly, like they didn't want to be caught noticing. Others lingered with barely hidden smirks, nudging each other in the ribs. The whispers were louder than they thought they were. That her? The fighter girl? Yeah, the one from TV. Hollywood queen thinks she can play soldier. Bet she doesn't last a week. The words carried easily in the damp air, sharper than they intended. Ronda didn't flinch. She had heard worse on her way up through the fighting world, from rivals, from crowds, from critics who had said she was only good until the next challenger. The difference was she had silenced those voices with her fists. Here, that wouldn't be an option. Not yet. Here she would have to prove herself in a place where proof wasn't measured in belts or applause, but in sweat, silence, and endurance. The first true test of the morning came in the form of Sergeant Harper. He emerged from the fog like something carved out of steel, his uniform crisp despite the damp, his broad shoulders straining against the fabric. His eyes were hard, pale, and his jaw was locked tight. He walked with the authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room, though when he did speak, the sound cracked like a whip. "Formation!" He barked, and the line of recruits snapped to attention with varying degrees of precision. His boots struck the gravel as he paced before them, his gaze sweeping over each face in turn. When his eyes landed on Ronda, the faintest flicker of something colder passed across them, and a slow, humorless grin curved his mouth. "Well, what do we have here?" His voice carried, deliberately pitched so that every man in the formation could hear. "They told me they were sending me a batch of recruits, but looks like they slipped in a celebrity. Ronda Rousey, isn't it? The fighter girl? The one who breaks arms for a living?" He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is a movie set, Rousey? You think there's a camera waiting to catch your best angle when you fall flat on your ass?" A ripple of laughter broke down the line. Some of the recruits tried to smother it, but most let it out openly, eager to ride on the sergeant's lead. Ronda stood still, her gaze fixed forward, her jaw tight but not clenched. She had walked into enough hostile arenas to know the rules. Silence was sometimes sharper than any comeback. Harper circled her like a wolf, his boots dragging lines into the gravel. "Tell me, Hollywood, when was the last time you crawled through mud? When was the last time you carried 50 pounds of gear over 10 miles without an audience to clap when you finished? Oh, wait, never. Because out here, nobody cares about your trophies or your interviews. Out here, all that matters is whether you can pull your weight and not drag the rest of these men down with you." More laughter. A few recruits muttered to each other, clearly emboldened. "She won't last a day. Bet she cries before sundown. Can't wait to see her fold." But if Harper expected her to drop her eyes to answer back or to shrink under the weight of his words, he was disappointed. Ronda simply breathed in slow and let it out, steady, as if he weren't even there. That silence infuriated him more than if she had cursed him. Fine, Harper growled, stepping back. You want to prove you belong here? You'll get your chance. Everyone else, double time to supply. Rousey, you stay with me. The recruits jogged off, some shooting glances back, some smirking, others curious. Ronda shifted her bag slightly, her muscles already tightening in readiness for whatever he had planned. Harper led her across the yard to a stack of heavy crates, ammunition boxes piled higher than her shoulders. You want to show me you're a soldier? He said. Move them. All of them. By yourself. No breaks. No excuses. And when you're done, the latrines are waiting. Every inch of them scrubbed until I can see my face in the damn porcelain. He folded his arms. Let's see if the great Ronda Rousey can handle a little dirty work. Shuri. The task was meant to humiliate, to exhaust her before she even began training. The crates were heavier than most recruits were expected to handle alone, and the latrine detail was considered punishment duty. It was the kind of assignment that broke spirits before they even got a chance to fight back. Ronda set her duffel down and stepped up to the first crate. Her hands gripped the rough wood, the muscles in her arms straining as she hoisted it up. It was heavy, far heavier than she wanted to admit, but she kept her face impassive. Step by step, she carried it across the yard, dropped it, and returned for the next. Harper watched with narrowed eyes, waiting for her to falter, for the strain to show. It did. Sweat ran down her back, her breaths came shorter, but still she moved. By the time the last crate was stacked where he'd ordered, her shirt clung to her skin, and her arms felt like lead. Harper's smirk faltered for the first time, though he quickly masked it with a bark. Good. Now the latrines. Move. The sun was higher by the time she finished, the stink of bleach clinging to her skin, her fingers raw from scrubbing. But when Harper came to inspect, expecting to find half-done work, the stalls gleamed. He said nothing at first, just stood in the doorway, staring at the spotless tiles. Then he glanced at her, a shadow of irritation flickering in his eyes. You think this proves something? He said, his voice lower now, edged with frustration. It doesn't. You're still nothing but a name they tossed in my unit to make headlines. And I'll break you, Rousey. I'll break you down until you quit or you prove me right. She didn't answer. She simply met his eyes for the first time that morning. Calm, steady. The silence was enough to make him turn on his heel and stalk out. Later, as the recruits gathered for chow, Ronda felt the weight of their stares. Some were mocking, others skeptical, but a few lingered too long, uncertain. The whispers still floated around, but they weren't as sharp as before. Not after watching her carry those crates. Not after seeing her come back from punishment detail without complaint. She sat alone at the end of a table, spooning food onto her tray in silence. Around her, laughter rose and fell, men sharing jokes, stories, insults, but the space around her remained untouched, as if invisible lines had been drawn. She didn't mind, for now solitude was better than hollow acceptance. She would earn what mattered the only way she knew how, with grit, with patience, and with the refusal to bend where others expected her to break. As night fell and the barracks quieted, Ronda lay awake staring at the ceiling, the ache in her muscles pulsing with each heartbeat. She could still hear Harper's voice in her head, still feel the weight of his contempt. But beneath that, there was a deeper echo, older and stronger, the same voice that had driven her through endless hours in the gym, the same force that had carried her through victory and defeat alike. You don't give them what they want. You don't fold. You keep going. Outside, the wind rattled the fences, carrying with it the faint sound of boots striking pavement in perfect unison somewhere far across the base. Tomorrow would be worse. She knew that. Harper would not let her presence go unchallenged. But she had come here not for his approval, not for theirs. She had come to prove something greater. And so she closed her eyes, steadying her breath, already bracing for the battles to come. The morning whistle tore through the barracks like a blade, sharp and merciless. Ronda was already awake before it sounded, lying still on the hard bunk with her hands folded across her stomach, listening to the breathing of the others around her. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, damp boots, and the faint metallic tang of old pipes rattling in the walls. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, lacing her boots with steady fingers, while the other recruits scrambled and muttered curses under their breath. Outside, the sky was just beginning to pale, streaks of orange and gray breaking through the night. The parade ground stretched before them like a sheet of cold stone, mist curling low across the dirt. Sergeant Harper was already there, his posture sharp as steel, his voice cutting through the haze. "On the line! Double time! Let's go! Hollywood and all!" The recruits rushed to formation, boots pounding against the ground in a chaotic chorus. Ronda fell in with them, her stride even, her face impassive. She felt the eyes on her, the snickers from a few men who still carried the previous day's amusement like a prize. Harper paced in front of them, his gaze sweeping, lingering on her with that same hard glint of disdain. "Today," he said, his voice rising, "you're going to learn what it means to work until your body doesn't want to stand anymore. You think you've trained before, that you've known pain, exhaustion, endurance. Forget it. Out here, none of that counts. Out here, you're nothing until you prove otherwise." He ordered them to drop for push-ups. The line hit the dirt, palms sinking into the cold, damp ground. Harper stalked the line, shouting counts, his voice cracking like thunder. At 50, some were already shaking. At 70, one man's arms gave out, and he collapsed onto his chest. Harper kicked his boot. "Pathetic. Get back up." When he reached Ronda, he stopped, his voice louder than before. "What's the matter, Rousey? Not enough spotlights? Not enough crowd chanting your name? Maybe you want me to call the cameras out here so you'll give us your best performance?" The laughter rolled down the line, harsh and ugly. Ronda didn't look up, didn't respond. She just pushed through another rep, then another, her breath steady though her arms trembled from the strain. Harper bent low, his face inches from hers. "You think this is a fight camp? You think your little arm locks and chokes are going to save you here? Out here you break or you get broken." Her eyes stayed locked forward, sweat dripping into the dirt beneath her. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a flinch. When the count hit 100, Harper barked for them to rise and run. They launched into a sprint across the field, packs heavy on their backs, breath fogging in the chill air. The sound of boots against dirt filled the morning, ragged and uneven. Ronda fell into pace, not at the front, not at the back, just steady, her breathing controlled. The pack bit into her shoulders, the straps rubbing raw against her collarbones, but she kept her stride. One by one, recruits began to slow, faces contorted in pain, lungs gasping for air. She passed a few of them silently, her eyes forward. The course twisted through mud pits, over logs, under barbed wire. Harper's voice carried over the grounds, barking orders, spitting insults. "Move faster! Get your belly in the mud, or I'll bury you there. Rousey, I hope you're enjoying your photo shoot." The men laughed again, but it rang weaker now, some of them too winded to even force the jeers. When they reached the wall climb, Ronda threw herself at it, fingers gripping the rough wood, muscles straining as she pulled herself up. For a heartbeat, she hung suspended, sweat dripping, then with a burst of effort, she swung a leg over and dropped down the other side. Harper stood there waiting, his expression hard. He leaned closer, muttering so only she could hear. "Not bad for a mascot." She didn't answer, brushing past him to rejoin the course. By the time they reached the end, most recruits were dragging themselves across the finish. The sun had burned away the mist, the heat rising now from the dirt in shimmering waves. Ronda's chest heaved, but her stride hadn't broken. She came in ahead of a dozen men, her face set in stone. Harper called them back into formation, his voice dripping with contempt. "Take a good look, boys. Our little Hollywood starlet thinks she's one of you. She can run, she can sweat, she can crawl in the dirt. Maybe she thinks that means she belongs. But don't be fooled. Endurance is one thing, war is another. Out there, she's a liability, and you'll pay for her weakness." The words struck the recruits, but this time, something was different. A few glanced at Ronda, not with mockery but with uncertainty. They had seen her push harder than some of them, had watched her run past men who had mocked her minutes earlier. The laughter was thinner now, hesitant. Ronda stood in silence, her breath slowing, her gaze locked forward. Inside, her body screamed with fatigue, her muscles burning. But she clung to that silence, the same silence she had carried into the octagon before a fight, the silence that steadied her when the crowd screamed. Harper's words were noise. The pain in her body was real, the test was real, and that was enough. When the training broke for chow, the recruits filed into the mess hall, their trays clattering, the hum of conversation rising. Ronda sat at the end of a table again, her food untouched for a moment as she let her breathing settle. The laughter and chatter filled the room, but she noticed the subtle shifts. The same men who had jeered at her earlier now kept their eyes on their trays, their mouths shut. A couple shot her quick glances, not hostile, but measuring. Harper passed through the hall, his gaze sweeping over the room like a storm cloud. When his eyes landed on Ronda, he smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. She met his gaze briefly, steady and calm, then lowered her eyes to her tray. That moment was enough to twist his smirk into something colder. He wasn't finished with her, not by a long shot. Later, back in the barracks, as the men dozed and muttered in their bunks, Ronda lay awake again, the ache in her body deeper now. She stared at the ceiling, replaying the day in her mind. The jeers, the endless push-ups, the weight of the pack digging into her shoulders, but also the moments where she had passed them, outlasted them, proved if only to herself that she could endure more than they expected. She thought of Harper's words, sharp as knives, and felt the ember of resolve burn hotter inside her. He wanted her to break. He wanted her to quit, to fold under the weight of his contempt. But she had come here for this, for the chance to be tested beyond what she had known. And as she closed her eyes, exhaustion finally dragging her under, one thought pulsed steady as her heart beat. Tomorrow he would push harder. Tomorrow the jeers would be louder. And tomorrow she would not break. The next morning arrived with the same sharp whistle, the same rush of boots against the floorboards and muttered curses as men dragged themselves from their bunks. The rhythm of the camp had settled into them now, though exhaustion clung to every movement, a heaviness that only deepened with each day. Ronda had slept little, her body still carrying the aches from the previous trials. But when she rose and tightened her laces, her hands were steady. She had known fatigue before, the kind that seeped into the bones after hours in the cage or days of relentless training. But this was different. Here there was no applause, no cameras, no victory at the end of the day. There was only survival and silence. Sergeant Harper's voice split the morning air as they gathered on the field. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes moving down the line of recruits with that same predatory calm. When his gaze landed on Ronda, it lingered, cold and dismissive before shifting on. Today, he barked, we take this circus into the field. You will operate as units. You will rely on each other. You will either succeed together or fail together. And out there, failure doesn't mean running laps. It means men die. So get it in your heads, if you can't trust the one next to you, you're already finished. They were divided into groups, and Ronda found herself placed with the weakest of the lot. She noticed the arrangement immediately. Harper had chosen the slower men, the ones already limping from overexertion, and grouped them with her. His intent was clear when they failed. The blame would fall squarely on her. They were marched to a stretch of marshland beyond the training grounds, the air heavy with the stink of stagnant water, the ground uneven and treacherous. The task was simple in words but brutal in practice. Carry full packs, weapons, and additional gear across the mire to a designated checkpoint several miles away. It was a test of endurance, teamwork, and willpower. The first steps sank deep into mud that sucked at their boots, pulling them down, stealing their momentum. The packs weighed heavy, straps cutting into shoulders, sweat already forming despite the morning chill. The men grunted and cursed, but they kept moving, their eyes locked on the tree line ahead where the checkpoint was hidden. After an hour, the weakest of them began to falter. Private Jenkins, a wiry young man with a pale face, staggered and nearly dropped his rifle into the mud. "I can't," he gasped, his knees trembling. "I can't carry this." The others snapped at him, their frustration spilling over. "Then you'll get us all chewed out," one hissed. Another shoved him forward. "Keep moving, damn it!" But Jenkins' pack slipped from his shoulders, thudding into the mud. His chest heaved as he struggled for breath, sweat streaking down his face. The group's progress slowed to a crawl, their formation breaking apart. Harper watched from a rise in the distance, arms folded, his expression unreadable, but his satisfaction clear. It was then that Ronda moved. Without a word, she swung Jenkins' pack onto her own shoulders, the straps biting into skin already raw from her own load. The weight nearly buckled her knees, doubling the burden pressing down on her. Her breaths came harder now, each step sinking deeper into the mud. But she kept moving, her face set, her eyes forward. The others stared, their anger faltering into disbelief. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of them muttered, almost grudgingly, "She's carrying his load." The pace picked up again, though slower than before, as they followed her lead. Each step was agony. The mud clung to their legs, packs dragging them downward, muscles burning with each pull forward. Ronda felt fire in her shoulders, her spine screaming beneath the weight, but she locked the pain away. In her mind, the voices of the men jeering at her days before rose again, sharp and mocking. She let them fuel her, each insult another reason not to stumble. Hours dragged by. The checkpoint loomed closer, just visible through the trees, when Jenkins stumbled again. He went down hard, face first into the mud, and didn't rise. For a moment, the group froze, panic rippling through them. "Leave him," one of them muttered, desperation edging his voice. "We can't carry him in the gear." But Ronda was already kneeling, sliding Jenkins' arm over her shoulder. With one hand gripping his wrist, she heaved him upright, his weight slumping against her. Now the burden was almost unbearable, 2 packs, her own and his, plus his body dragging against her side. The world narrowed into the rhythm of her breathing, the pounding of her heartbeat in her ears. Step, drag, step, drag. The others fell silent as they followed. No more jeers, no more muttered complaints, just the sound of boots in mud, rifles clinking against straps, and the rasp of strained breathing. When they finally reached the checkpoint, the sun was high and merciless, burning down through the treetops. Ronda collapsed to her knees, lowering Jenkins carefully to the ground. Her arms trembled violently, sweat pouring from her, but her eyes were steady as she looked up at the instructor waiting there. Harper stood at the edge of the checkpoint, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. For a moment his mask slipped, irritation flashing in his eyes. He had expected failure. He had wanted it. But she had dragged them through, carrying more than any of the others. He sneered, forcing the mask back into place. "Don't think this means anything. You think dragging dead weight proves you're a soldier? Out there, that kind of stupidity gets everyone killed. You don't carry the weak. You cut them loose." The recruits shifted uncomfortably, but none of them laughed. They had seen what she had done. They had followed her, not him, across the mire. Ronda said nothing, only wiped the sweat from her face with a mud-streaked sleeve and pushed herself back to her feet. Her silence carried louder than any words could have. That evening in the mess hall, the atmosphere was different. Conversations were quieter, laughter muted. Jenkins sat hunched over his tray, shame burning his cheeks, while others cast uneasy glances at Ronda. No one spoke to her directly, but the sneers were gone, replaced by something harder to define: uncertainty, perhaps even the first threads of respect. Harper passed through the hall, his eyes narrowing when he saw her. He hated the shift, hated the way the men had looked at her when she carried what none of them would. His voice rang out sharp. "Enjoy it while you can, Rousey. Tomorrow I'll remind you what happens when you try to play hero." But his words didn't bite the way they had before. Ronda looked down at her tray, her jaw steady, her breathing calm. She knew he would push harder, would try to break her with everything he had, but she also knew something had changed. The men had seen, and no matter what Harper said, that could not be taken back. When the lights dimmed and the barracks fell quiet, Ronda lay awake again, the aches in her muscles deeper than ever. Yet beneath the pain, there was a steadiness she hadn't felt before. She had carried more than her share and hadn't fallen. She had endured where others had faltered, and tomorrow when Harper came at her again, she would be ready. The days that followed the march through the mire were thick with tension. The memory of Ronda carrying Jenkins across the mud lingered in the minds of the recruits, clinging to their thoughts like the smell of damp earth on their boots. Around the mess hall, in the barracks, even on the training field, the atmosphere had shifted in small, unspoken ways. The jeers were quieter now, the laughter thinner. Some of the men who had been loudest in their mockery before now avoided her gaze altogether, while others stole furtive glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking, as though trying to reconcile the woman in front of them with the image they had ridiculed. Sergeant Harper, however, carried himself with a colder edge than ever. His disdain no longer came with the smug satisfaction of a man watching a plan unfold. Now it was sharper, laced with irritation, because he had seen his recruits hesitate, had seen their laughter falter, and he knew why. Ronda's presence had unsettled his authority, not with words, not with open defiance, but with the simple fact of her endurance. She had stood where others would have fallen, and that truth gnawed at him like a splinter beneath the skin. On the training field, his eyes sought her out more often, his barked orders landing hardest on her shoulders. If the recruits were tasked with 20 push-ups, Harper demanded 40 from her. If they carried their packs across the yard, he loaded hers with extra weight. Every exercise was another attempt to grind her down, to force the men to see her collapse. But collapse never came. Her body shook, her muscles screamed, but still she moved, still she held her ground. It was during one of those sessions, beneath the punishing sun, that the tension reached its breaking point. The recruits had been lined up for hours, drilling formations until sweat poured into their eyes and their legs trembled from the repetition. Harper's voice cracked through the air, relentless. Again! Again! You call that precision? You're not soldiers. You're a marching band gone drunk. Ronda's uniform clung to her skin, soaked through, her throat raw from the heat. She could feel the men beside her faltering, shifting uneasily, their discipline fraying at the edges. Harper's boots struck the ground as he paced in front of them, his gaze predatory. He stopped in front of her and sneered. You think you're keeping up, Rousey? You think running a little further than the rest means you belong here? This isn't a competition for medals. This isn't your circus show where the crowd claps when you stand back up. Out here, your kind gets people killed. The words were loud, sharp, designed to cut, and the recruits laughed again, though their laughter sounded strained, uncertain. Some forced it out in short bursts, others chuckled half-heartedly, but it was enough to sting the air. Harper smirked at their reaction, then leaned closer to her ear, his voice low enough to be heard only by her. I'll break you in front of them, Rousey, and when I do, they'll see what you really are, a fraud in a uniform. He barked another order, and the drills intensified. Push-ups until their arms shook, then squats until their legs burned, then burpees in the dirt until some collapsed with groans. When one of the men fell flat on his stomach, Harper kicked his boot and ordered him back up. But when Ronda hesitated for the briefest of moments, he pounced. On your feet, Rousey. What's wrong? Tired already? Maybe we should get you a yoga mat and a nice cold towel for your face. The recruits laughed louder this time, emboldened by his performance. One of them, a stocky kid from the back of the line, called out, Careful! Don't want to hurt her. She's got to save her strength for Hollywood. Another snickered, Bet she cries herself to sleep tonight. Ronda pushed herself upright, her chest heaving, her muscles screaming in protest. She kept her eyes forward, her jaw clenched, refusing to let them see the fire building in her chest. The laughter rolled around her, sharper now, biting deeper with each echo. She could feel their eyes on her, their delight in her supposed weakness. Then it happened. As they lined up again, Harper strode past her and shoved her shoulder with the flat of his hand, hard enough to make her stumble. She caught herself before she fell, but the smirk on his face told her all she needed to know. He had meant it, meant to humiliate her in front of them. The recruits froze for a heartbeat, the laughter catching in their throats. They waited for her to lash out, to snap, to give them the show they were craving. Ronda's heart hammered in her chest. For a split second, her instincts screamed to strike back, to grab his wrist, twist, and send him crashing into the dirt. The movements flashed in her mind with perfect clarity, the muscle memory of years in combat ready to take over. but she forced it down, swallowing the impulse like poison. If she snapped now, if she retaliated, Harper would win. He would paint her as unstable, unfit, a danger to the unit. She steadied her breath and stepped back into line, her face unreadable. The silence stretched, heavy, electric. The men waited, restless, the air thick with the tension of the moment. Harper's smirk widened, satisfied with the stumble. But in his eyes there was a flicker of something else, frustration that she had not struck back, that she had denied him the explosion he had been baiting. The drills continued, each one harsher than the last. Harper's commands grew sharper, his insults more vicious, and still she endured. Her body ached, her vision swam with exhaustion, but she refused to bend. By the time the whistle finally blew to end the session, the recruits staggered back to the barracks like men returning from battle, their uniforms plastered to their bodies, their faces drawn and pale. That night in the mess hall, the laughter was subdued. The recruits sat hunched over their trays, their voices low, their eyes flicking toward Ronda with unease. The image of her stumbling beneath Harper's shove lingered in their minds, but so too did the memory of her silence, her refusal to break. Some of them respected it, though none would say so aloud. Others resented it, angry that she hadn't given Harper the collapse they wanted. Harper entered the hall late, his boots echoing against the floor. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on her. For a long moment, he said nothing, just let the silence stretch, his presence enough to draw the attention of every recruit. Then he smirked again and moved on, his tray clattering as he sat alone at another table. Ronda sat quietly at the edge of her own, chewing methodically, her mind replaying the shove, the laughter, the fire that had surged in her chest. She had held it back this time, but she knew the line between endurance and explosion was wearing thin. Harper was pushing harder, and sooner or later the clash he wanted would come. She didn't know when or how, but she could feel it building in the air, heavy as the storm clouds gathering beyond the horizon. That night, as the barracks quieted and the men drifted into uneasy sleep, Ronda lay awake once more, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. Her muscles throbbed with pain, her skin burned from the sun, and her mind buzzed with restless energy. Harper's words replayed in her ears, sharper than the bark of his orders. He would keep pushing until the breaking point came, but when it did, she promised herself it would not be her who broke. The storm that had been building for days finally broke on a scorching afternoon when the recruits were called to the training field once again. The air was heavy with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and made every breath feel like a burden. The men lined up, sweat already glistening on their foreheads, though the drills had not yet begun. Ronda stood among them, her shoulders square, her gaze fixed ahead, though she could feel the weight of Harper's stare pressing against her like the sun itself. He had pushed her, taunted her, shoved her, and still she had not broken. Today, she sensed, he would not settle for silence. Harper's voice rang out across the field, sharp and cutting. He barked orders, forcing them through push-ups until arms shook, then into sprint drills across the dirt. His insults flew just as relentlessly as his commands, each one aimed to cut deeper. When one recruit faltered, he shouted at them to keep moving. When Ronda hesitated for the briefest moment to adjust her pack, he pounced. There it is. Hollywood can't keep up. Maybe we should get her a stunt double to finish for her. The recruits laughed, though even now their laughter sounded hollow. Then Harper called the line to a halt. He paced before them, his gaze sweeping the line like a hawk circling prey. He stopped in front of Ronda, his smirk stretched wide. You think you belong here, Rousey? You think running a little farther, sweating a little more, means you're a soldier? No, all it means is that you haven't yet been shown your place. His eyes glittered with a cruel satisfaction as he stepped back, raising his voice so every man on the field could hear. Tell you what, men, since our Hollywood princess thinks she's tough, let's see if she can prove it. Right here, right now, in front of all of you. The recruits shifted, murmurs rippling through the line. Excitement sparked in their eyes, the restless hunger for spectacle. Some grinned, others looked uneasy, but all of them leaned forward as the words settled in the air. Ronda's jaw tightened, her heart hammering. This was what he had wanted all along, the moment where he could strip away her silence and force her into a confrontation. Harper spread his arms wide, his grin mocking. You and me, Rousey. A little sparring match. Don't worry, I'll go easy. Wouldn't want to ruin that pretty Hollywood face. The laughter returned, but weaker this time, tinged with nervous energy. Ronda took a slow breath. She had held back through every insult, every shove, every attempt to humiliate her. But this was different. He had called her out, not just before him, but before all of them. If she refused, the men would see only weakness. If she agreed, she risked giving him exactly the spectacle he craved. Yet deep inside, she knew it was inevitable. This clash had been written into every step of their path since the day she arrived. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the dirt, and the circle of recruits closed around them, their eyes bright with anticipation. The air grew still, heavy with expectation. Harper rolled his shoulders, bouncing lightly on his toes like a boxer preparing for a bout. He smirked across the circle at her, his voice mocking. Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll make this quick. The recruits jeered, some shouting Harper's name, others calling out insults to Ronda. Show her what real soldiers fight like. Knock her down, Sergeant. But beneath the noise there was an undercurrent of unease. They had seen her endure, seen her carry more than her share. Now they wondered what she would do when the fight was no longer metaphorical. Harper lunged first, his fist cutting through the air in a wide arc aimed at her face. Ronda moved just enough, the punch grazing past her cheek. The recruits roared, the circle alive with shouts. Harper swung again, faster this time, a sharp left hook, but she leaned back, letting it slice harmlessly through the air. Her eyes never left his, calm, steady, unblinking. Stand still, damn it, Harper snarled, his frustration boiling as he launched another series of strikes. Ronda slipped each one, her movements economical, precise, her breathing steady. To the recruits, it looked like she was dancing, taunting him with her silence. To Harper, it was infuriating. The crowd howled louder, some laughing, others shouting encouragement, the energy feverish. But Ronda held her ground, letting him burn himself out, letting his anger drive him into wild, careless swings. Sweat poured down his face, his breath coming faster, harsher, while hers remained calm. Finally, Harper charged, both fists swinging in a reckless flurry. That was the moment she moved. In a heartbeat, her hand caught his wrist, twisting it with practiced precision. With her other hand, she guided his arm past, using his own momentum against him. His body flipped over her hip, slamming into the dirt with a grunt that stole the air from his lungs. The circle erupted in gasps, the laughter dying mid-breath. Harper scrambled to his feet, rage twisting his face. He lunged again, swinging wildly, but Ronda sidestepped and swept her leg low. His boots left the ground, his body crashing down harder this time. Dust rose around him, hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The recruits stared, mouths open, their jeers silenced. Harper groaned, trying to push himself up, but Ronda was already there. She knelt beside him, her hand firm on his shoulder, pinning him down with ease. Her voice was low, calm, but it carried across the circle. This isn't a show, Sergeant. Out there, you fight like this. You don't come home. You mock scars. You forget what they cost. The words cut sharper than any blow. Harper froze beneath her grip, his chest heaving, his pride shattered. Around them, the recruits held their breath, the silence pressing down heavy. For the first time since she had arrived, not a single laugh rose in the air. Ronda released him and stood slowly, her eyes sweeping the circle of men. She did not gloat, did not sneer, did not smile. Her face was calm, steady, her boots heavy against the dirt as she stepped back. The silence deepened, heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. Harper lay in the dirt, his pride broken, his authority cracked. The recruits shifted uneasily, their earlier hunger for spectacle curdling into something else, respect and shame. Ronda looked down once more, her voice steady as she spoke to them all. We don't fight for ego out here. We fight for lives. Don't forget that. She turned then, walking through the circle as it opened for her. Not one man spoke, not one dared to laugh. For the first time since dawn, The field was quiet, not because Harper demanded it, but because silence had been earned. And as she walked back toward the barracks, the recruits watching her with wide, unsettled eyes, Ronda knew the balance had shifted. The fight was over, but the real battle, the one for respect, had only just begun. The dust from the fight still hung in the air long after the men had dispersed from the circle. The recruits returned to their bunks and duties with a heaviness in their steps, their voices muted, their laughter gone. The field that only an hour earlier had rung with jeers now felt like hallowed ground, and every man who had stood in that circle carried the weight of what he had witnessed. Harper's fall was not just the collapse of a sergeant's authority for a moment, it was the collapse of an illusion. They had mocked, laughed, and doubted, and in silence Ronda had shown them what strength really was. That kind of truth was not easily shaken. Ronda walked back toward the barracks without a glance behind her. Her muscles ached, her throat burned with the dust she had breathed in during the fight, but her mind was steady. She had not gone into that circle to win applause. She had gone to end something that had been festering since the day she arrived. Now it was finished. There was no satisfaction in humiliating Harper. There was no triumph in putting him on the ground. The victory was in the silence that followed, in the absence of laughter, in the eyes that had watched her and seen. Finally, not a celebrity or a woman trying to play soldier, but a comrade who would not break. That night in the mess hall, the change was unmistakable. The room usually pulsed with chatter, the scrape of trays, bursts of laughter echoing from table to table. Tonight, the voices were quieter, the movements slower. Recruits who had once shouted across the room to mock her now kept their conversations close, their tones subdued. Ronda sat at her usual place at the end of a long table, her tray simple, her motions steady as she ate without expectation. She had grown accustomed to the isolation, to the wide circle of space that formed around her wherever she sat. But tonight things were different. It began with one, a young recruit who had been silent during most of the jeering, a boy whose eyes had betrayed unease when the others had laughed the loudest. He picked up his tray and moved quietly toward her table. He didn't ask if the seat was taken. He simply set the tray down and sat across from her, lowering his head and eating without a word. Ronda didn't glance up. She didn't acknowledge him, but she felt the shift all the same. Then another followed, sliding into the seat beside the first. Then two more. Before long, the table that had always been empty except for her was filling, one recruit after another joining in silence. They did not speak to her, and she did not address them, but their presence was louder than words. They were admitting something without saying it, showing respect without speeches or apologies. The last to approach was Harper. He carried his tray stiffly, his jaw set, his pride still stinging from the humiliation of the day. He did not sit close. He placed his tray at the far end of the table, as though the distance between them could shield him from what had happened. His hands gripped the edge of the metal tray until his knuckles whitened, his eyes fixed on the food before him. He did not speak, did not look at her, but his presence there, at her table, was an admission no less powerful than the silence of the others. The clatter of utensils was the only sound for a long while. Men ate, some glancing at her now and then, their eyes full of something new. Not pity, not guilt, but recognition. They had seen her fight. They had seen her endurance. They had seen the truth of her words when she said they did not fight for ego, but for lives. It was no longer possible to dismiss her as an outsider. She was one of them now, not because anyone said it, but because she had forced them to see it. It was a younger recruit, voice quiet, who finally broke the silence. He set his fork down and looked across the table at her. "Why?" he asked. His words were barely above a whisper, yet every man at the table heard them. "Why did you come here when you didn't have to? You've already proved yourself out there. You didn't need this." Ronda's eyes lifted from her tray, calm and steady. She let the silence stretch for a moment before she answered, her voice low but clear. "Because I've buried too many, and all I had left to hold on to them was these hands. I gripped tight so I'd never let go again." The boy swallowed hard, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. No one else spoke. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was reverent, heavy with the weight of her words. Each man felt them settle deep, stirring something they could not name. They had mocked her for her scars, but now they understood. Scars were not trophies. They were names, memories, burdens carried so others would not have to. From that night forward, things changed. In training, the laughter aimed at her was gone. When they lined up, men who had once jeered now kept pace beside her, their silence a sign of respect. During drills, some began to watch her movements, learning from her endurance, her precision, her refusal to waste energy on anger. A few even asked quietly for her to show them techniques after hours, questions whispered with awkward respect. She never boasted, never gloated, never reminded them of their cruelty. She simply taught, steady and patient, her silence still her strongest weapon. Even Harper changed, though his change was the most reluctant. He no longer singled her out with barbs or shoved her to the ground with feigned accidents. He barked orders at her as he did at the others, sharp and unrelenting, but without the edge of contempt. He had tested her, pushed her, tried to break her, and he had failed. His silence in the days after the fight was an acknowledgement of that. He would not speak it aloud, but his restraint was louder than words. The turning point came during a long march through the hills beyond the camp. The sun was merciless, the terrain steep and unforgiving. Packs weighed heavy, rifles dragged at sore shoulders, and the line of recruits stretched thin. When one of the men twisted his ankle on a loose rock and stumbled, it was Ronda who moved without hesitation, shifting some of his load onto her own and guiding him forward. This time, there were no mutters of, "Leave him." No one mocked. Instead, two others stepped in to help, lifting the weight together until the injured man could walk again. Harper saw it from a distance, his eyes narrowing. He did not interfere. He didn't need to. The lesson had been learned. In the weeks that followed, the barracks felt different. Ronda was no longer the isolated figure eating at an empty table. She was part of the group, not because anyone declared it, but because silence had shifted into solidarity. When the recruits spoke of respect now, it was her name that hovered unspoken in their minds. Not the respect of celebrity or spectacle, but the respect of someone who had endured, someone who had carried more than her share and never asked for recognition. And though she rarely smiled, though her words were few, there was a sense of steadiness around her that anchored the others. They began to understand what she had meant when she said they did not fight for ego. They began to see that true strength was not loud, not boastful, but quiet, enduring, unshakable. One evening, as the sun sank behind the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of crimson, Ronda sat outside the barracks, her arms resting on her knees, watching the fading light. The sounds of the camp drifted around her, boots on gravel, voices carrying in the distance, the hum of engines. She closed her eyes and breathed deep, the ache in her body a reminder of every step, every burden, every silence she had held. For the first time since she had arrived, she did not feel alone. The respect she had earned was not given freely, but it was real. She had not come here to prove herself to Harper, or to the recruits, or even to the army. She had come to prove something to herself, that she could endure again, that she could stand in the fire and not break, that her scars could mean something more than memory. And as the last light of day slipped behind the hills, Ronda knew she had found what she had come for. Not glory, not acceptance, but respect. The kind that could not be mocked away, the kind that could not be stripped by words, the kind that only silence, endurance, and truth could earn. If this story kept you hooked, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. We've got more unbelievable stories waiting for you, and the next one will blow your mind even more. Click over to watch the other videos on this channel right now, and make sure to share this video with your friends so they can feel the shock too.